All right, guys, welcome back. So our third line of defense in our immune system is the specific response to a particular pathogen. This is called the adaptive immune response and is a targeted immune response to specific types of infection. These responses begin when specific types of lymphocytes or leukocytes that we covered in this, during the circulatory system, those white blood cells, actually detect a foreign molecule of some kind. Many times you'll hear these referred to as an antigen. An antigen is simply a molecule on the surface of a bacteria or a virus or other pathogen that triggers that specific immune response. So those white cells are able to recognize those specific antigens on the pathogens. This specific type of response, the adaptive immune response, involves the use of white blood cells called lymphocytes. Now, these lymphocytes can be broken up into two different types. These are called B cells, which mature in the bone marrow and is responsible for what's called humoral immunity. And humoral immunity is important because it's targeted specifically at bacteria or other pathogens that stay outside of our cells. While T cells are the other type that mature in the thymus gland and are responsible for what's called cell-mediated immunity. And this is a type of immune response that targets intracellular pathogens. And so, for example, if you remember back when we were talking about viruses and how they actually get into our cells and then use our own cellular machinery against us to produce copies of itself, the T cells would be what mount an immune response to our cells that are infected with virus. Now, just to break down humoral immunity in a bit more detail, so B cells recognize an antigen. So remember the antigen being the part of a bacteria or other extracellular pathogen and responds with production of more B cells. So basically it detects that antigen and it starts making copies of itself. Now, during this copying process, it makes two specific types of B cells. The main type that's produced are called plasma cells. Now, the plasma cells have a specific job, and they're responsible for producing what are called antibodies that specifically respond to that specific infection. And importantly, for long-lasting immunity, so immunity beyond, the initial infection, they also produce what are called memory B cells. And so, as the name implies, these memory B cells are specialized in actually remembering, this particular antigen that your body encountered. So it contains the antibody so that if that specific antigen is ever encountered again, the immune response can be much faster and much stronger. Now, in cell-mediated immunity, T cells recognize infected human cells, and also they're responsible for attacking tumor cells as well. So it recognizes them as infected cells. And they're responsible for coordinating against cell-mediated immunity. So in this process, T cells recognize and attack these infected cells and then continue to search for more infected cells to kill. This type of immune response also recognizes tumor cells, as I said previously. Importantly, these cells recognize any foreign cell. And so as long as it detects a particular cell as not belonging to you, it's going to attack it and try to kill it. And so this is why, if you've ever thought, if you've ever wondered, why transplant patients have to receive, anti-immune medication to suppress their immune system, it's because their own T cells will want to attack that foreign organ that they received through transplant. So, for example, if a patient received a new kidney, right, the patient's own immune system would recognize that kidney as not belonging to them. And so it would continually try to attack that kidney. And so that's why patients that have received transplants have to receive that medication for the rest of their lives. All of these types of immune responses that we've been talking about are examples of active immunity. And active immunity is where you actually produce the antibodies and other immune cell types to combat the pathogen. Oops. This includes exposure to the actual disease itself. So in this sense, you encountered the disorder or the disease, within your own body. You fought it. Your immune system was mounted. You won. You remember it. But it can also be things like a planned exposure to a form of antigen that has been killed or weakened. And so this is basically what a vaccine is. And so they give you a killed or weakened version of a particular pathogen so that your immune system can recognize it. And then if you ever encounter the real disease, trying to get into your body, you'll have those memory cells that can detect it and mount an immune response effectively. Now, passive immunity is when you don't actually produce the antibodies for yourself. And a good example of passive immunity is a mother and child. So a mother will pass immunities onto her baby during pregnancy. And so this is important because that baby's immune system isn't fully developed when they're born. And so these antibodies actually serve to protect the baby for a short period, usually about the first 6 months of life. Following birth, while its immune system kind of develops and gets on track. And this lasts until those particular antibodies die from the mother, and at that point, the baby's immune system takes over and is able to mount its own response. Now, there are certainly ways that we can help our immune systems. There are obviously drugs and other things that we take to help our immune systems along, kind of fight foreign invaders. One of the most important are antibiotics. Now, these are specially designed to kill bacteria without harming our cells. And so I'll say that again because it's an important point. So antibiotics are specifically designed to kill bacteria, and they only work on bacteria only. Antibiotics work by interfering with the cellular processes of particular microorganisms. It's interesting to note that most are actually produced naturally. So we've actually been able to extract them from things like fungi. But today, some are made synthetically, and so we're able to make them in the lab. We have the technology to do that. The first antibiotic produced was penicillin, and this is widely still in use today. Importantly, antibiotics will not work on viruses. And so if you ever have like a cold or a flu, which are common types of viruses, and a doctor prescribes you antibiotics, that's not going to work at all on that particular disease. And so this is an important point that I will say I actually do like to quiz on. And so if I do ask you on a quiz or an exam, what types of infections do antibiotics actually work against? The answer is bacteria. Okay? Of course, you might be wondering, what about all of the over-the-counter medications that I get when I'm, feeling crummy and I have a cold? Importantly, these are over-the-counter drugs because they do not actually treat the disease itself. They only treat the underlying symptoms, and so they only function to make the symptoms kind of go away, so you can kind of mount your immune response and then get rid of whatever it is, the virus, the cold virus, the flu, or whatever. So these are over-the-counter medications for cold, for example. will specifically target, suppressing your coughing and sneezing and kind of soothing a sore throat. It'll loosen your mucus up a bit, but it does not actually attack the cold virus itself. So the cold virus kind of has to run its course, and then you kind of go back to normal. Now, the best thing that we can do when we have, a type of cold virus or something that needs to run its course is just rest, try to continue with a well-balanced diet as much as possible, and get plenty of fluids. And we'll stop here and we'll continue in the next section talking about vaccines and the immune response the vaccine produces.